the history of innovation. In the late 90s, this company called Norske Skog, Norwegian Forests, they had realized that these Asian tigers, implying India and China, were entering hyper growth on gross national product per capita, and that they were going to end up inevitably within 5 to 10 years becoming civilized countries, as in having the wealth and the living standards close to what we have had experienced in the West over the last 50 years. They understood that this was an immense opportunity for them, so they did some research and they hired an innovation researcher to figure out how to take advantage of this and actually leverage this. So this researcher did historical research on what had occurred in the West as we became industrialized and increased our living standards and gross national product per capita, and they found this pattern emerging, which was that first the country becomes industrialized, then it acquires better schooling system, increasing literacy, better infrastructure, facilitating for more and more people getting newspapers. So Norske Skog basically bought up everything of like forest and small paper producers and whatever they could get their hands off in the late 90s in Norway, under the assumption of that the Asian tigers were going to have a similar type of evolutionary curve that the Western Hemisphere had experienced over the last 100 years. There was just one problem, which was that 5 years before they started purchasing paper producers, this little thing had been invented. You might have heard about it. It was called the World Wide Web. So what occurred in Asia was that they did something that innovation researchers are referring to as a frog leap. Frog leap basically is the equivalent of that when you are walking upstairs towards, you see the stairs behind me. So I can walk one step at a time towards my bedroom upstairs, right? At which point I take one step at a time, or I can frog leap, which implies if I'm running, I can take 2 or maybe 3 steps every single step I am moving upstairs. Now, the Asian tigers conducted a frog leap, implying that nobody cared about paper or newspapers in Asia. They couldn't care less because they never had that evolutionary step in their evolution. So nobody read newspapers, and Norske Skog almost went bankrupt as a consequence of this, because they had conducted these massive investments under the assumption that they were going to have a return on their investment that was like, you know, fairy tale figures for their shareholders' ability to have profit and pay out dividends. So there's a similar thing happening in software development today, and it is called low code. Low code. And low code has all the traits that are required to conduct or perform a so-called frog leap. Now, in order to understand why, you must realize that, so I'm a software developer. I started coding when I was 8, I'm 48 today. I'm probably one of the 0.01% most experienced software developers in the world today, by sheer numbers. I mean, I've got 4 years of software development experience. I've probably on average been coding for like 50 hours at least weekly since I was 8 years. I did a math on this like 3-4 years ago. I think I had like 83,000 hours of software development behind me. I'm kind of like the Native Americans of the 1492. To be honest with you, my profession is dying, it's obsolete, it's almost no longer required. At the very least in the States, it currently exists within. To understand why, we must look at how it has been to traditionally teach yourself how to create software. You see, if I take an example programming language, such as C sharp, right? Now C sharp requires me to learn OOP, OOD, OOA, the sign patterns, it requires me to learn solids, it requires me to learn cohesion, and I don't have enough whiteboard, and I could go on like this for 100 whiteboards, right? The problem is that, you know, and then of course I need to learn the .NET framework, the class hierarchy, right, or .NET Core or whatever, right? Now, to become an experienced senior C# software developer takes 10 years. So, I mean, sure, you'll probably get the senior title after 2, 3, 4, 5 years or something, but I mean, you're useless for the first decade next to super experienced senior software developers such as me. So, I mean, with C#, I run in circles around everybody the first decades of their official employment. So it takes a decade, 10 years, 10 freaking years. That's a lot of years, right? Then you have these constructs that are based upon love code, such as our hyperlambda. Hyperlambda does not have any OOP, does not have any OOD, does not have any OOA, no design patterns, no solids, and it doesn't require you to learn a framework. Okay, it does require you to learn the slots, the documentation for the slots, but I mean, these are simple lookups. You go to a documentation, 2 minutes later, you know exactly what that slot does and how to use it. So the only thing you're left with is like, out of all of these problems, okay, cohesion is the only problem you're left with that you need to actually teach yourself. And some other, I mean, 5% of the mental energy required to learn C#, right? So, I mean, the task of learning hyperlambda, I've taught hyperlambda to dozens of software developers, most of whom didn't even know how to speak English, and I had to, so we had to use Google Translate to you know, translate back and forth, and I was able to teach it to them within some 3 to 4 days, and you know, after a month of experiencing and using it hands-on, they were basically proficient software developers. Now, this is a problem. So we have all of a sudden, we have gone from a requirement of 10 years to 1 month, right? That's a frog leap, by the very definition of the term. It's a frog leap. Because it turns all of your existing knowledge obsolete. Everything you thought you knew about software development, it doesn't matter, event syncs, sagas, DDD, domain-driven design, you know, all of these things you spent the last 2 decades teaching yourself is useless. It's garbage knowledge. You don't need to know it even. We saw the same thing happening as, you know, the photography was invented in the late 19th century, early 20th century. We saw similar things. Before that time, you know, artists had to spend a decade teaching themselves how to mix their own paint. You look at something like Rembrandt, you know, it probably took him 20 years to become a truly professional painter and artist. And then comes the camera in the early 20th century, and any schmuck with you know, above average income can buy a freaking camera from Canon and ka-ching, Rembrandt, ka-ching, Rembrandt, ka-ching, Rembrandt. And we saw the existing artists as a consequence of this. Actually, that art had to change because naturalistic, you know, supernaturalistic art such as Rembrandt was no longer of any interest. So this is the reason why we saw artists such as Picasso and Salvador Dali, and also later Andy Warhol emerging during the 20th century, because in order to actually provide value as an artist, they had to do something else that the camera couldn't do. Of course, now the camera can create Andy Warhols too, so what are these guys going to do? I mean, you go to an art exhibition today, you'll find the artist having a plate with a fork and a knife and poop in the middle of the plate, selling it for 100,000 euros. Right? Because there's nothing left for them. There's nothing left for them. I mean, I can take a photo of myself, I can apply an Instagram filter on it, and ka-ching, it looks like Andy Warhol production. It looks like Marilyn Monroe, created by Andy Warhol. So the low-code revolution in software development is really inevitable, right? It's a frog leap, it's an opportunity. Now, to understand that, let's go back further in history to the Dodo. So everybody here have heard the story of the Dodo. The Dodo was living alone on an island, it had no natural enemies, so it grew and grew and grew and grew and grew in size, became immensely huge, and it lost the ability to fly. Why would it need to fly? It had no enemies. So I mean, spending energy on flying was just like obsolete for the Dodo. And this process, of course, happened over millions and millions and millions of years of evolution, where the Dodo slowly lost the ability to fly. Then comes John Doe with his canoe and his shotgun to this island 200 years ago. And 10 years later, ka-ching, no more Dodo. Walking lunch. In fact, the Dodo didn't even fear human beings. Why? Because fear is one of those things that you're acquiring through evolution, through the survival of the fittest mechanisms, due to an outside threat that resulting in that you need fear to survive. The Dodo didn't need fear. He could be fearless. There was no mental framework within, like, you know, the brain of the Dodo that allowed him to experience the feeling of fear. So he ended up as lunch. And that's what's happening with software development today, actually. And the reasons why, of course, is because, I mean, the average low-code framework, right, allows the enterprise to deliver 10x on everything. 10x on quality, 10x on time to market, 10x on costs. I could go on. I don't have enough whiteboard to list all the benefits related to low code.